In July 1943, everyone on that vast battlefield on the Eastern Front knew what was coming. Soviet forces had gained a large salient, and the Germans urgently needed to shorten the front lines. The logical response was to encircle and reduce it, destroying large Soviet formations within. In preparing Operation Citadel, Adolf Hitler and his generals were seizing a high-risk window of opportunity, the last, best chance to regain the initiative in Russia before Soviet material power grew overwhelmingly strong and before the Western Allies could establish themselves in Europe. The Soviets faced a difficult challenge, a test of their ability to manage a large and intricate combined arms battle against a first-class, heavily armed and experienced enemy. For weeks, the Germans and Soviets had been amassing men, tanks, guns and aircraft from all sectors of the Eastern Front in and around a 100-mile salient centered on the Ukrainian city of Kursk, some 400 miles south of Moscow. All that remained to be decided was the time to begin and the precise locations, which Soviet intelligence had been unable to determine. Adolf Hitler had repeatedly postponed the date. At least 3 times the Soviet High Command, known as the Stavka, had raised false alarms. Then, on the afternoon of July 4, 1943, the Germans sent their men in, the sure signal. An Alsatian serving in the Waffen-SS promptly defected and convinced a team of high-ranking interrogators, including the commander of the Voronezh front, General Nikolai Vatutin, and the 49-year-old political advisor Nikita Khrushchev, that the German offensive would be launched before dawn on 5th July. Granting the Germans the advantage of tactical surprise could prove fatal. Khrushchev quickly informed Moscow. Joseph Stalin returned the call and, according to Khrushchev, asked him for his opinion, to which he replied that, "We will make the enemy pay in blood when he tries to advance." At 10:30 p.m., over 600 heavy guns and rocket launchers began the opening of the Battle of Kursk by shelling German artillery positions and assembly areas on the Voronezh sector of the front. The groundwork for this epic tank battle had been laid almost 2 years earlier, when the Wehrmacht had failed to invade the Soviet Union in the lightning campaign projected by Operation Barbarossa. The long list of specific German errors can be conveniently grouped under 2 words: overextension and underextension. Both reflected the general sense of emergency that Hitler's Reich had conveyed from the first days of its existence. Time was always Adolf Hitler's chief enemy. He believed that only he could create the 1,000-year Reich of his visions, and to that end he was willing to take the most extreme risks. Hitler's generals shared this risky way of thinking and accepted the apocalyptic visions that accompanied it. Most significant was an operational plan that lacked a decisive objective. Instead, Barbarossa's armored spearheads were arrayed in what appeared to be a starting line in intrinsic directions toward Leningrad, Moscow and Kiev, and increasingly depleted as they were moved from sector to meet emergencies as the Red Army defended itself fiercely and effectively. Behind the front, the Soviet government mobilized resources and developed capabilities to thwart the invasion, seize the initiative, and debunk the myth of an inherently superior German war-fighting capability. The initial result was a stalemate as Soviet counteroffensives staggered the Wehrmacht, but failed to destroy it. During the winter of 1941 to 1942, both sides regrouped and reformed. On April 5, 1942, Hitler issued Directive 41, which outlined the operational plan for the summer of 1942. Its focus would be south, a major campaign into the Caucasus to destroy Soviet forces in the region and seize oil fields vital to both the Soviet and German war efforts. A secondary objective was Stalingrad, not for its own sake, but to cut the Volga River, isolate the Soviets south of this industrial city, and cover the main assault flank. The goals of the offensive were no less ambitious than those of Barbarossa. It would be launched on an 800-kilometer front. Its objectives would create a salient, a bulge of more than 2,000 kilometers. Road and rail networks would be stretched as the Germans advanced. Scheduling the main attack for late June left, at best, 4 or 5 months before rain and snow put an end to major mobile operations. Even if the offensive succeeded, there was no guarantee that the Soviet Union would collapse or effectively cease fighting. It had other domestic sources of oil. It also had the support of the United States and Great Britain, committed to keeping the Soviet Union in the war at all costs. Nevertheless, for Hitler and his high command, the operation made sense. It offered the opportunity to consolidate the Reich's military and economic position against the establishment of a second front in Europe, something Hitler considered possible as early as 1943. It extended the land war to Asia Minor and beyond, where immediate returns and possibilities seemed somewhat simpler. And it offered the German army a second chance to do what it had hitherto done best: win a mobile campaign in a limited time. German forces deployed. Background. Model Sector, the 20th Corps, with 4 infantry divisions, would hold the 9th Army's right flank firm. Then came the 46th Panzer Corps. It had only a few tanks under its command, but its 4 infantry divisions were as good as any in Russia. That was provided by the 47th Panzer Corps, 3 armoured divisions and another good infantry division, commanded by Lieutenant General Joachim Lemelsen, who had commanded mobile troops since 1938. Joining Lemelsen was General Joseph Harp's 41st Panzer Corps. Harp's corps was Lemelsen's left shoulder to cover his advance and build on his success. The 23rd Corps, concluding Model's sector to the east, was ordered to mount a secondary attack towards the town of Maloarkhangelsk. In reserve were 3 mobile divisions, 2 Panzer and 1 Panzer Grenadier. These were under the control of Kluge, not Model, and to be sent only when the breakthrough was assured. Thus, Model commanded in total some 335,000 men, 600 tanks, and 300 assault guns. There were no Panthers, and a single Tiger battalion would join Lemelsen's corps only at the start of the attack. As compensation, Model received 2 battalions of Ferdinands, 88mm assault guns built on the chassis of a Tiger design scrapped for production. The Second Army held the bulge. With 7 reduced-strength infantry divisions and fewer than 100,000 men, it was assigned no role at Citadel beyond maintaining the link between the 9th Army and Army Group South, which was configured to do the hardest and most difficult work. Hermann's 4th Panzer Army Hoth had to perform a trifecta: break through, and exit the rear of the salient. To accomplish this, Hoth had nearly 250,000 men at his disposal, including some of the best troops in the German army. Hoth formed his front line, assigning the left half of his sector to the 52nd Corps and its 3 infantry divisions. In the center, the 48th Panzer Corps had 1 infantry division, 2 panzer divisions, and the elite Grossdeutschland division. Designated as either a Panzer Grenadier division or a mechanized infantry division, the Grossdeutschland was configured as a full-fledged panzer division and was at the top of the Wehrmacht's list for replacements and equipment. The corps also included an independent tank brigade with no fewer than 200 brand new Panthers, providing a total of around 600 armored fighting vehicles. Alongside the 48th Panzer Corps, it was arguably an even more formidable instrument of war. The SS Panzer Corps had 3 divisions: the Leibstandarte, the Das Reich, and the Totenkopf division. They had fought separately until they were reunited for Manstein's counteroffensive in early 1942 and had gained a reputation as warriors who gave no quarter and only did so when convenient. Called Panzer Grenadier divisions, they were panzer formations in all but name. The corps had around 500 tanks and assault guns, including 42 Tiger tanks. Army Detachment Kempf was located on Hoth's right. This was a formation larger than a corps, but smaller than an army. It had 9 divisions at the beginning of July, 3 of them panzer divisions attached to the 3rd Panzer Corps commanded by General Hermann Breith. Kempf's detachment was originally intended as a blocking force, but its role grew when it became clear that the defences to its front might be little less important than those facing Model and Hoth. Army Group South also had reserves, a Panzer Division and the 5th SS Panzer Grenadier Division Viking. Staff officers and officers on the ground were openly critical of the repeated postponements of Citadel, But delaying the attack provided the breathing space, the rest that the Germans so desperately needed. Operation Citadel, start of operations, July 5, 1943. North Sector. For the Soviet Central Front, Operation Citadel began in the early hours of July 5th. Around 2 a.m., the 13th Army reported to headquarters that one of its patrols had captured a German sapper clearing minefields in preparation for an attack it said would take place at 3 p.m. Zhukov immediately authorized Rokossovsky to unleash his artillery, and only then telephoned Stalin with the news that this was not an exercise. The counter-curtain of fire from the Central Front opened at 2:20 a.m. However, the Soviet artillerymen had not managed to pinpoint the German positions with complete accuracy. The specific results were contingent. The weight and intensity of the bombardment, however, were so great that the German High Command agreed to delay the attack for 2.5 hours in the model sector to allow the German artillery to respond. The first raids took place at 3:25 a.m. Medium bombers and Stukas repeatedly attacked the network of gun positions around Maloarkhangelsk. After an hour of this, supplemented by an artillery barrage against the same targets, the infantry advanced. On the extreme left, the 23rd Corps was tasked with capturing Maloarkhangelsk and anchoring the armoured advance. The left flank and centre divisions penetrated just over 1.5 kilometers into the defence system and were then repulsed by local counterattacks. The main attack was carried out by the 78th Assault Division, which was joined by a battalion of 45 Ferdinands. Anchored by bunkers supported by half-buried tanks, the Russian position was a nightmarish version of the types of defences the Americans would encounter 2 years later on Okinawa. It quickly earned the nickname Panzer Hill, but the Germans believed they had an armoured opponent. By the end of the day, only 12 of the original 45 Ferdinands remained fit for combat. The aforementioned lack of hull-mounted machine guns was less of a source of discomfort for the Ferdinands than the absence of their own infantry. On the ground, Model brought over 500 armoured vehicles into play on July 5th. About half were out of action by the end of the first day. Many of these could be repaired. Nonetheless, the effect on crew morale was significant. So too were the consequences of occupying ground, falling back to relieve trapped or unhinged infantry, and then repeating the entire exercise a few hundred meters farther on. The infantry had also suffered, not only in terms of numbers, but because the nature of the fighting took a disproportionate toll on the most daring and the leaders. Walter Model was anything but a rear-guard command. 103. He spent the first few hours of the day with the 2 Panzer Corps and then returned briefly to his headquarters, where reports were less than rosy. The 9th Army commander spent most of the afternoon visiting headquarters, moving armour and artillery in response to what looked like crises or opportunities, and coming to the conclusion that the situation justified committing his immediate reserves the next day, the 2nd and 9th Panzer Divisions, to exploit breakthroughs in the XL7 Panzer Corps sector. That was possibly the consequence of a genuine miscalculation, underestimating the depth of the Soviet defenses and their ability to resist. But for Citadel to succeed, even if the Soviet threat against Army Group Center turned out to be a pipe dream, Model had to break through and get out, and he had to do it quickly. South Sector. All forces on the southern bank were under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein. The Field Marshal and Model had little in common as commanders, but their initial orders were almost exact duplicates. 2 strong corps coming down the center, covered on each flank by weaker elements. Army Group South would attack in concentrated force from the Belgorod-Tomarovka line, break through the Soviet defenses, and meet Model somewhere east of Kursk. The 48th Panzer Corps and the Waffen-SS had nearly 1,100 tanks and assault guns between them. The 4th Air Fleet numbered nearly 1,100 aircraft, and 966 of these were concentrated in the 8th Air Corps, which specialized in direct ground support. Manstein expected to have nearly 250 Stukas and 75 tank destroyers from the outset. On 10th May, Manstein met with Hoth and the senior commanders of the 48th Panzer Corps. By then, Manstein had already decided that a straight line was the shortest distance between 2 points. Given the geography of his sector, the best option was a massive frontal assault by armor, using the limited infantry forces to provide flank protection. The initial objective was to cross the Sel River and then capture the town of Oboyan, situated at a road junction. Kursk would be the next stop. In the course of a spontaneous discussion about how best to make it work, Manstein insisted that it was not only going to be a hard fight, but a long one as well. The main battle would begin only when the first lines of defense had been penetrated. That alone would require detailed and precise planning based on the combined arms tactics that were the essence of Panzer doctrine. Lead with heavy tanks, artillery to clear anti-tank positions, and expect major Soviet air attacks from the outset. The next day, Manstein communicated the same urgency to the SS at Corps headquarters. Take nothing for granted and assume they would continually face strong defenses. They had to prepare well, as this was no time for heroic improvisation. Manstein may have been conveying his misgivings. It may also be that he was emphasizing the importance of an early breakthrough. In any case, in the weeks before the attack, he respected the established German principle of delegation, allowing subordinates to plan the details and hear their specific proposals. The Panzer divisions rehearsed with small units, emphasizing cooperation with the Luftwaffe and tactics for overcoming anti-tank defenses in depth. After a long meeting, Hoth recommended to Manstein that instead of advancing in a straight line with the XVIII Panzer Corps, the two SS Panzer Corps should detour northeast without going beyond the Sel and push the Russians back toward its guns around the village of Prokhorovka. The 3rd Panzer Corps, in turn, would shift its axis of advance northeast and strike at the Soviet right flank attacking the SS. The 48th Panzer Corps, with the Grossdeutschland division doing the heavy lifting, would keep abreast of the SS, changing direction to match their movements, and reinforcing the expected decisive engagement when necessary. From there, the 4th Panzer Army could advance in any suitable direction, north to directly intersect Model, northeast into the Russian left rear in the Oral salient, perhaps even east for another time-buying right blow. Finally, Army Group South's attack began in the late afternoon of July 4th. On the 48th Panzer Corps sector, the Panzer Grenadier battalions of the Grossdeutschland and 11th Panzer Division advanced in torrential rain against the Soviet forward zone and its network of fortified villages. The Grossdeutschland had begun the war as an elite infantry regiment and prided itself on maintaining traditional infantry skills. But mines, small arms, and artillery turned what was expected to be a frontal assault into a stop-and-go operation that dragged on into the afternoon. The fighting was hard enough, and casualties high enough, that the division and corps assumed the defenses had been breached and ordered the main armored force to move into attack positions. Dawn arrived around 3 a.m. with the promise of warm, clear weather. During the night, there had been further heavy thunderstorms in the Manstein sector, and much of the ground was soft for most of the day. Of more immediate concern was the Soviet bombardment, which delayed the initial attack until about 4:10 in the morning, when artillery and rocket fire pounded the forward positions of the Voronezh front for 50 minutes. Stukas and medium bombers of the 8th Luftwaffe Corps appeared as the barrage ended, hitting the Kursk railway station and Russian artillery positions to the rear, then switching to the visible strong points of the forward defenses. The 48th Panzer Corps advanced with 3 divisions at once, the 3rd, the Grossdeutschland, and the 11th, over 450 tanks and assault guns in total. Some 350 of these were on the 3-kilometer sector of the Grossdeutschland front. The Panthers were slowed by the wet, muddy terrain and subsequently ran into a minefield, some of which were lost. Other tanks became stuck in the mud trying to get out. The battalion of GD infantrymen the Panthers were escorting and supporting was supposed to push forward, but it too was trapped and cut to pieces. It took 10 hours for sappers to clear paths through the minefield so that the damaged tracks could be repaired. The Russian defences were the usual maze of trenches, minefields and strongpoints, further reinforced by the damp ground that reduced the speed of the armoured vehicles. The ideal outcome for a German attack was a more or less simultaneous penetration of a defence sector. The more bunkers eliminated, the more gaps would open in the wall of fire, and the more vulnerable the entire system would become to a coordinated attack from the front and flank. The 3rd Panzer Division on the left of the GD had an easier time. With its left flank effectively covered by the 332nd Infantry Division, the 3rd's Panzer Grenadiers took the Korovino strongpoint late in the day, and a tank battalion took advantage of the transfer of local reserves to that location to break through the forward defences of the 71st Rifle Division and operate a narrow salient 5 kilometers from the Soviet rear. Advance towards Prokhorovka, Hauser's SS Panzer Corps. Hoth's final attack directives to the SS Panzers, repeated in the July 1st order, were to break through the first 2 Russian defence lines and then advance with all forces to the Sel River in the Prokhorovka area. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps had the, and already expected, more demanding task in the Manstein sector. The identity of the Waffen-SS was built around its armoured divisions. From their unpromising military beginnings, they had earned a prestigious reputation as some of the most formidable fighting formations in the brief history of armoured warfare. The SS Panzers began rolling in at 4 a.m., and from the outset met determined combined resistance. From left to right, the citadel alignment was Totenkopf, Leibstandarte, and das Reich. Another 500 armoured fighting vehicles on a front of less than 12 kilometres. The advance was made across relatively open terrain, through fields of grain and the steppe grass. As the tanks advanced and the Soviet positions opened fire, the newly arrived Tiger tanks took over the bunkers, while the lighter tanks covered the infantry, which began clearing the trenches and also the sappers, who blasted the anti-tank ditches to install ramps so the tanks could advance. The sappers and infantry reduced the surviving bunkers with grenades, demolition charges and flamethrowers. Each anti-tank gun had to be silenced individually. Each trench was cleared by traversing it from one side to the other. Each bunker was taken in close combat. A Das Reich flamethrower carrier wrote of the strange sensation of serving this destructive weapon, and it was terrifying to see how the flames advanced and engulfed, devouring the Russian defenders. There was nothing to distinguish the adversaries in terms of bravery and determination. Tactical skill didn't count in close-quarters fighting, but the Germans had 3 things going for them. One was the armament of their tanks, not only for their long range, but also for the excellent sighting equipment that allowed accurate targeting of the Russian positions. The second advantage, specific to each sector, was the 3rd Infantry Battalion in each of the SS Panzer Grenadier regiments and the increased strength and flexibility it provided. The 3rd was the Luftwaffe, which demanded 15 hours of virtually uninterrupted and unopposed air attack with up to 80 aircraft at a time. These wreaked havoc not so much on the forward positions, but on the second-line trenches, the mortar, gun and rocket positions built to withstand shelling but vulnerable to direct air attack. By 9 a.m., the Germans had broken through the first line of defense. But every report reaching higher headquarters confirmed a resistance of an unprecedented nature and scale, despite the relative ineffectiveness of Soviet air attacks. Until 4 p.m. that the Leibstandarte captured the key point at Bitkova, and by then 1/3 of the 52nd Guard's original 8,000 men were dead or wounded. 30 minutes later, the SS Panzers received the order to advance, break through the next defense system and establish a bridgehead over the Sel. It took another 90 minutes to organize the attack, which quickly ran into an anti-tank front, an integrated system of gun positions that controlled the spearhead of the Tigers to a point where the divisional command ordered it to halt. Das Reich had maintained pace on the right of the Leibstandarte, despite initial problems caused by the wet ground, in maintaining contact between the infantry and tanks. During the night assault, several parties of the 3rd SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment had infiltrated the forward line and cleared part of the road before the main attack began at around 6 a.m. By about 8:15 a.m., Das Reich had reached its initial main objective, the strong point in the village of Berezov, and the Panzer grenadiers were clearing it with flamethrowers. However, it was not until 4 p.m. that the division's final objective fell to a hastily brought-up reserve battalion. Initially, the Totenkopf had also played its supporting role well, pushing the 155th Guards Rifle Regiment back and out of its way, but was then held up by a tank brigade blocking the road to Oboyan. Nevertheless, Hauser, his divisional commanders, and Horth regarded the SS prospects for the following day as favourable. The same cannot be said of Army Detachment Kempf. Its first task was to cross the Donets. No aircraft were available. The artillery was so weak that 3 Luftwaffe flak regiments were temporarily assigned to it as substitutes, an indirect fire role, unsuitable for the high-speed 8s. Consequently, Kempf and his corps commanders agreed to a crossing on a broad front, spearheaded by his 3 Panzer divisions. From the Russian point of view, the Germans were doing well enough to be confident. For this reason, the Soviets moved their reserves. Lieutenant General Ivan Chistyakov, commanding the 6th Guards Army, managed his reserves carefully and was able to deploy 2 fresh divisions into his second echelon of defences between the afternoon and evening of 5th July. Vatutin ordered his tanks forward to block the German penetration and restore the 6th Guards Army's front. 2 corps from the 1st Tank Army would engage the Xeliate Panzer Corps, while 2 independent Guards Tank Corps would engage the SS from the front and flank. On paper, that brought the total number of Russian tanks committed against the 4th Panzer Army to around 1,000. On the ground, the commander of the 1st Tank Army, Lieutenant General Mikhail Katukov, was receiving alarming reports about the Tigers' performance. The 6th Guards Army's riflemen were holding on by their fingertips, but they offered no stable base for a large-scale counterattack. By the night of July 7th, Army Group South's maps presented a disconcerting picture. Hoth's tanks were, in fact, working through the defences as the SS had advanced more than 20 kilometres, but they were still creating more salients than sectors. The resulting flanks were under increasing pressure as they prospered. The attacking divisions were diverting ever larger forces, tanks and infantry, to shore them up. Neither the Army Group nor the 4th Panzer Army had effective reserves available. Hoth's headquarters reported 2 fresh tank corps moving into the Oboyan road sector and increasing truck activity on the Panzer Army's eastern flank. Once again, Manstein made his case to the High Command to commit the 24th Panzer Corps. But that corps represented the trump card of the entire southern sector, even though its 2 understrength panzer divisions make it more of a weak card than a figure in the Citadel contexts. Attack, July 10th to 17th, 1943. Up to that point, Army Group South's momentum had been circumstantial. The Russians had provided the mass. On the night of July 8th, Vatutin and Vasilevsky had one mission: to hold the Germans in place for the upcoming counteroffensives on both sides of the Kursk salient. That meant holding the centre, from Prokhorovka to the Oboyan Road, and continuing to pound Knobelsdorf and Breith while attacking the defences to their front. Panzer Army had been reduced to 600 action-ready armoured fighting vehicles by the morning of 9th July, a 40% loss of the total. The Army's spearheads were still 80 kilometres from Kursk, almost 160 kilometres from the bogged-down model front, and 3 days behind the initial objective of a 2-corps bridgehead over the Selle. Hoth had not lost confidence in the prospects for an eventual breakthrough and victory. But the 48th Panzer Corps, under General Knobelsdorf, was still under such heavy pressure on its left flank that it could not deploy its full strength frontally. Breith's panzers remained entangled in the Soviet defences on the east bank of the Donets. Luftwaffe reconnaissance reported large and growing Soviet armoured forces moving westward and southward toward the Psel. Both official doctrine and common sense demanded an all-out effort to intercept the movement. The Luftwaffe had originally been configured for just that kind of mission, but the need for direct ground support had intensified so much that no aircraft could be spared from the front lines. Therefore, Counterattacks from the northeast involving the SS could only be expected to increase in strength and combat power until they eventually matched and outmatched the Panzers. Hoth's original idea for this contingency was to draw the Soviets into a battle on terrain chosen by the Germans. Open terrain, where the longer range of their tank guns and their excellent optics would give them the kind of technical advantage denied in earlier close-quarters fighting. The weight of the plan rested squarely on the shoulders of the Waffen-SS. Hoth would not willingly admit it, but ideology, experience, and armament made the SS better suited than the army's panzers to force a breakthrough in a frontal attack. Furthermore, as party troops in an army war, they were more expendable. Hoth had originally hoped that the army and the SS would keep pace and be in a position to act together as they approached the Selle. Instead, the 48th Panzer Corps was falling behind, a consequence of the resistance in its front and the continuing threat against its left flank. Order number 4 of 9 July for the 4th Panzer Army was ambiguous. The 48th Panzer Corps would press the powerful right flank up the Oboyan Road, throw the Russians back onto the Selle, and at the same time secure its left flank for good by attacking and enveloping the 6th Tank Corps. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps would drive northeast with all available strength, while maintaining a strong protective flank against any attack from Prokhorovka. By 10th July, Hauser was expected to be ready to shift his axis of advance to the prop, BW-IA Prokhorovka, if the move became necessary as Soviet reinforcements arrived. Manstein directly backed Hoth's move by giving Hauser priority for air support. More important was Manstein's continued pressure on Kempf and Breith for the 3rd Panzer Corps to advance north toward Prokhorovka, widening and integrating their front, covering the SS by intercepting the 5th Guards tank army. But first Breith had to clear his own sector. The 19th Panzer Division spent a long, hot and frustrating 8th of July in a series of back-and-forths with Russian counterattacks that nearly broke the overstretched lines of the 168th Infantry Division, complicating its advance on the Donez from Belgorod. The last 4 operational Mark 6s of a Tiger company, plus half a dozen flamethrower tanks, were needed before the 19th could even consider breaking through and advancing on any scale. On the other flank of the 3rd Panzer Corps, the 7th Panzer Division remained committed to its flank protection role. "No changes are planned for today. I had slept well," in the words of a Tiger Company commander. But one infantry division, the 106th, was being rushed to relieve the Panzers, making the 7th available to support what appeared to be the first real tactical opportunity Breith's corps had created since the fighting began. That was the job of the 6th Panzer Division, whose day began when 2 of its tank companies were fired on while resupplying in a forward area, and continued when an inexperienced and ambitious lieutenant led his tank platoon in a heads-down charge to the top of a hill, only to find itself pinned down by the usual Soviet defensive heavy fire. But things looked up when the division's armored forces found enough exploitable points in the 92nd Guards Rifle Division's defenses to reach and capture the high ground north of Melikovo, some 20 kilometers northeast of Belgorod, before running into impassable belts of minefields, guns, and anti-tank ditches. Up to this point, it was just another salient, another extended middle finger. But if the 19th and 7th Panzer Divisions managed to close in on the 6th, the result could be a crippling closed-fist karate chop. Initially, Knobelsdorff responded to Hoth's revised orders by redeploying a Grossdeutschland battle group, 2 Panzergrenadier battalions, and over 50 tanks and assault guns, including a Tiger company, turning them west to cooperate with the 3rd Panzer and 332nd Infantry in finishing off the 6th Tank Corps. Knobelsdorff believed the diversion would be temporary. But despite outstanding Stuka support, the advance required 90 minutes to reach the last houses on the northern side of Verkopenya against the tank-supported 67th Guards Rifle Division. Moreover, this was not the same as having the village cleared and secured. The battle group was also under heavy artillery and Katyusha fire from the west, a clear indication that the 3rd Panzer Division was not yet out of danger. Panzer Grenadier Regiment and the Grossdeutschland Reconnaissance Battalion, with the rest of the division's armour, resumed the advance on Oboyan around 6 a.m. The Panzers ran into an anti-tank screen. The Reconnaissance Battalion sidestepped it and continued moving under the cover of Stukas. So far, so good, at least enough for the Grossdeutschland commander to move the tanks at Verkopenia to reinforce what he considered the crux of his attack. The Panzers passed between the half-tracks and assault guns of the reconnaissance battle group and engaged the 86th Tank Brigade at ranges long enough to allow the Panthers and Tigers to maintain the advance along the Oboyan Road until higher orders told them to halt in the afternoon around the village of Novosilovka. As stated above, Hoth's orders to the 2nd SS Panzer Corps contained as many as 4 potential missions: to break through the Soviets' immediate front, disrupt incoming counterattacks by the Red Army reserves, draw up the Red Army's panzer divisions on its left, and open an alternative route to Kursk. Any one of these was a major task. Hauser's orders, issued at 11 p.m. on the 8th of July, were accordingly ambitious. The overall intention was for the Corps to make contact with the 11th Panzer Division, destroy the Soviet forces south of the Seal, and establish bridgeheads across the river in preparation for a further advance on a broad northeasterly front. Das Reich would develop its present position into a main battle line. The Totenkopf would advance west-northwest, make contact with the 11th Panzer Division, and force a passage of the Psel. The Leibstandarte would clear its front, then begin to shift positions, moving between the Totenkopf and Das Reich to become the Corps' center division. As soon as possible, the tank regiments of the Leibstandarte and Das Reich were to be withdrawn from the line for resupply and the rest of their exhausted crews. The Leibstandarte advanced around 10 a.m. on the 9th of July, with its 4 remaining Tigers spearheading the march. The division had suffered 1,500 casualties in 4 days, most of them in the combat regiments, but morale was high and improved further when a company of Mark IV's broke up a counterattack by a regiment of T-34s. By midday, the SS had crossed the Solotinka River and made contact with the advance guard of the 11th Panzer Division. Elements of both divisions reached the village of Kochetovka, headquarters of the 6th Guards Army, before being stopped by the reorganized 10th Tank Corps, which showed it still had a fighting spirit, and by heavy rocket and artillery fire. As day declined, the Leibstandarte began to swing the Corps left wing toward the Totenkopf. This relatively new Death's Head division wasted no time in organizing a head-first frontal attack toward the Cell. Despite stiff resistance from the Guards' rearguard and survivors of the 3rd Mechanized Corps, the 31st Tank Corps, and the 51st and 52nd Guards Rifle Divisions, the SS gained some 16 kilometers. The division's artillery guns and tanks literally blew up the Guards' headquarters outside Kochetovka before the Panzer Grenadiers stormed the village. The Totenkopf's main attack next turned northwest to high ground some 2 or 3 kilometers outside Kochetovka, overlooking the approaches to the Psel. There it first encountered the shield and sword tactics of dug-in tanks and fixed defenses fighting to the bitter end, while mobile T-34s launched repeated counterattacks. The Totenkopf remained motionless, and until nightfall, its sappers and Panzer Grenadiers failed to build a bridge across the Psel and establish a foothold on the far bank. Das Reich also spent the day without moving, blocking with relative ease a series of attacks along the Prokhorovka road by the 2nd Tank Corps and the 5th Guards Tank Corps. But in the evening, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps received ground and air reconnaissance information confirming main armoured movements northeastward against the Corps' right flank, along with intense air activity. A column with 250 trucks and up to 80 tanks had already passed through Prokhorovka. The Soviet force was so large that German forces scouting in the opposite direction had been withdrawn. Additional armoured reserves were likely to be brought in outside the Citadel sector. July 9th was a long day at Voronezh Front main headquarters. By the end of the day, the 6th Guards Army and the 1st Tank Army had sacrificed even the most basic tactical maneuverability. Their original formations were shredded, and subsequent reinforcements were in no better shape. Totenkopf was able to muster about 100 armoured fighting vehicles. The commanders of both armies had spent most of the day requesting immediate support and asking when the 5th Guards Tank Army would arrive. In making and implementing decisions for July 10th, Manstein and Hoth had to take into consideration another set of statistics. The 4th Panzer Army had received a maximum effort from the 8th Air Corps, but that term meant something different after 4 intense days. The Luftwaffe flew more than 1,500 sorties, twice the number achieved by the Soviet Air Force on July 9th. The initial fuel shortage expanded to tools and spare parts. On the ground, Hoth had expected that the 48th Panzer Corps would now be on the far bank of the Saale, and that the 3rd Panzer Corps would be closing in on the SS right flank. Instead, both were still fighting their own battles. The pressure against the 4th Panzer Army's flanks had increased exponentially as the advance progressed. Hoth was optimistic enough to believe that the 48th Panzer Corps could, within a day or two, clear its flank and cross the Saale. He believed Breith was capable of freeing himself to support Hauser as planned, but both circumstances remained conditional at Citadel. Neither Knobelsdorff nor Breith seemed capable of practically stepping out of their own way. Hoth decided the time had come to flip the switch. Panzer Army's frustrations on the 10th of July began on its ever-nagging left flank. From the beginning of Citadel, and even before, the Grossdeutschland had been Hoth's main asset, with more hopes pinned on it than on the SS. Even with the remaining strength of the 10th Panzer Brigade attached to it, the division had fewer than 90 armoured fighting vehicles at 3:30 a.m. when its armoured battle group advanced against the high ground across the road, southward to Berezovka and the 3rd Panzer Division. That road was also the main north-south artery in the sector, and the defenders' main link to the Soviet supply base at Kruglik. If it were permanently severed, the 48th Panzer Corps flank problems would take a major step toward resolution. The Grossdeutschland secured sufficient tactical surprise to overwhelm the 200th Brigade of the 6th Tank Corps and draw 2 more brigades into a battle in which the Germans took advantage of their combined arms. The Grossdeutschland's artillery and attached rocket batteries were supplemented when rain and thunderstorms permitted by mast-level bomber and Stuka attacks. A battalion war diary commented on the marvelous accuracy of the dive bomber attacks, which seemed capable of engaging and destroying the T-34s almost at will. In an exemplary maneuver of battle group tactics, the Grossdeutschland's reconnaissance battalion, its mechanized Panzer Grenadiers, and assault guns seized Hill 247. After 3 grueling hours, the Panzer Regiment marched the trucked Grenadiers onto neighbouring Hill 243. Meanwhile, the 3rd Panzer Division completed its bridgehead and crossed the Penya in a short left hook that outflanked stubborn Russian rearguards and brought the division's armoured battle group into line with the Grossdeutschland. During the afternoon, the 2 German divisions caught the Russians in a pincer grip which, by nightfall, left the front line on the Berezovka heights and reduced the 6th Tank Corps to fewer than 50 armoured fighting vehicles, half of which were T-70 light tanks, little more than panzer fodder. But once again, the Russians buckled without breaking. Some surrounded units fought their way through the same type of terrain that had halted their attacks and now obstructed those of the Germans. Others fought to the bitter end, using Katyushas against the armoured fighting vehicles until the panzers brought them within range. The Panzer Grenadier Regiment that Grossdeutschland left in front of the Saale suffered repeated attacks from units that, even by Eastern Front standards, should be considered ineffective, but Citadel was different. The Germans brought into play anything that moved on tracks or fired rapidly. Thinly armoured, open-top, self-propelled anti-tank guns took the places of assault guns that should have been employed under other circumstances. 88mm anti-aircraft guns were anchored to improvised ground positions, and their crews were grateful that the weather prevented Soviet air attacks. And as nightfall fell, the weary Germans stayed in place, still a long way from where Hoth and Knobelsdorff had expected them to be. The 11th Panzer Division reached high ground along its front, but then stalled. From there, it was literally downhill toward the Sel Valley and some 20 kilometers to Oboyan. The town's buildings were visible with binoculars, but the Russians held Hill 244 on the Oboyan road itself, against everything the 11th Panzer sent at it. The division commander requested Stuka support in vain. As a result, July 11th was spent consolidating its positions and patrolling toward the Psel. It seemed like a domestic military task, but the prospects of a single division attacking a citadel-style defensive system, even a broken one, were almost zero. Most of Grossdeutschland, along with the 3rd Panzer Corps, was still busy clearing the left flank of the 48th Panzer Corps of Soviet fragments, scouting the new lines of defense in that sector and regrouping. As if Nobelsdorf did not have enough problems, at 11:30 a.m. on the 10th of July, his headquarters welcomed a visitor. Heinz Guderian, in exile since the failure of Barbarossa, had been appointed, on 1st March 1943, Inspector General of the Armoured Troops. He had been tasked by the Army High Command with finding out why the Panthers seemed to be performing so badly. Guderian concluded that a major problem was training. The Panther battalions sent to Citadel had been unable to get used to their new vehicles, which meant a high level of minor technical problems and increasing pressure on the field maintenance units. The radios hadn't even been tested and set to the correct frequencies before the offensive began. Nobelsdorf and his staff could not be held responsible for decisions made far above their level of authority. That absolution did not resolve Knobelsdorf's tactical dilemma. To understand what might have appeared to be limited activity on the part of the 48th Panzer Corps on the 11th of July, it is worth noting that it took time to clear sectors, reorganize units, and conduct resupply and maintenance. Moreover, the recently won Corps' rear had not even developed a network of roads, let alone highways. As combat units and support echelons began to shift into position, traffic control was becoming a major challenge. A week of fighting that tested endurance to its most extreme limits also had human consequences, ranging from misunderstood orders to outbursts of rage to simple physical errors committed by exhausted or traumatized men. German personal memoirs and unit histories dealing with the Eastern Front encourage overlooking these factors. They are usually imbued with a kind of heroic vitalism that implies that fear and fatigue were weaknesses to be acknowledged but overcome. Otto von Knobelsdorff was no Erwin Rommel or Erhard von Knobelsdorff, Raus when it came to inspiring or convincing all-out efforts. However, he retained control of his sector and was confident that his system could stay far enough away from its Russian counterpart to offer him some advantage on the 12th of July. There were also material reasons for optimism. The Provisional Panther Regiment, still attached to Grossdeutschland, had gone into action on 10th July with only 10 tanks. During the 11th of July, 20 more were returned to service from workshops whose personnel were just beginning to be made aware of the tank's mechanical peculiarities. By the end of the day, the regimental commander reported 38 Panthers operational. Soviet counterattack, July 12th. Hauser was ready to carry out the orders of July 12th. That, however, did not mean a massive frontal attack, 3 divisions at the same time driving into the jaws of the Russian guns. Hauser intended a sequential operation. The Totenkopf's armored battle group would cross the Sel and advance north, then turn east to reach the Kartashevka-Prokhorovka road, which on the map offered a clear route to the rear of the main Russian position. The Leibstandarte's 1st Panzer Grenadier Regiment, with a tank battalion, would get underway at 4:50 a.m. and establish left flank protection. The rest of the division was to capture Hill 252, the Stalinsk State Farm, then Prokhorovka, but only once the Totenkopf attack had destabilized the Russians. The Das Reich, in turn, would drive east, seize the high ground south of Prokhorovka, and establish positions to extend the attack on July 13th. The Das Reich orders also made it clear that the division was expected to accelerate its pace and maintain contact with its partners, regardless of threats to its southern flank. However, the Soviets also planned and prepared counteroffensive operations to be launched after the German offensive had ground to a halt. Panzer divisions had remained almost in place since the beginning of Citadel. Even under the best of circumstances, any success achieved by the SS at Prokhorovka was going to be limited, if not short-lived, if the 3rd Panzer Corps did not break through in force from the south. On the morning of the 9th of July, their circumstances did not look especially promising. Against the newly reinforced 35th Guards Rifle Corps, the Germans faced another day of hard fighting for limited results. Just before noon, 4 Tigers, the last operational in the 3rd Panzer Corps, drove a company of Panzer Grenadiers toward Hill 211 in the 19th Panzer Division's sector. But Russian tank counterattacks became so heavy that the attached infantry regiment of the 19th Panzer Division gave ground, later reporting that it could hold out no longer. The division commander managed to re-establish the line, but by the end of the day, the 19th Panzer Division had only a dozen operational tanks. Kempf reported that the 3rd Panzer Corps could advance no further. Manstein responded by paying Kempf a supposedly inspiring visit and ordering him to continue the attack. At first, the Panzer Grenadiers made good progress and then took the lead in the attack by the 2nd Guards Tank Corps and the 2nd Guards Tank Corps. The Guards were ordered to break through the German positions in front of them, then move south to cover the main attack of the 5th Guards Tank Army and exploit their own success to the fullest extent possible. Instead, they ran into and outflanked the forward elements of a Panzer Grenadier battalion, broke into the rear echelons of the home regiment, and were forced to fall back after fierce street fighting in and around German-occupied villages. In the early afternoon, the 2nd Russian wave entered the scene when the 2nd Tank Corps hit the SS positions. It was the weakest of Rotmistrov's main formations. One of its brigades was reduced to 80 riflemen and 20 tanks, half of them T-70s. Another had 40 men and 14 tanks. Nevertheless, nearly 30 of the group's tanks broke through only to encounter Das Reich Panzers, who, having long since abandoned any thoughts of an offensive, were supporting the main line of resistance. The Germans made particularly effective use of an improvised company of captured T-34s, whose familiar silhouettes meant far more to their opponents than hastily applied German insignia and paint. The German crews had ample time to learn the T-34's weak points from within and systematically sought flanking shots by aiming for the external fuel barrels. According to one official report, within a short time, all 50 tanks were ablaze. During the afternoon, the Das Reich sector was hit by violent storms that turned the battlefield into a quagmire, limiting the mobility of even the T-34s. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps returned to its start lines, leaving dozens of wrecks behind and reporting that the Germans were hot on the Corps' heels. Indeed, Das Reich headquarters understood that the division could do nothing more than secure its own positions and see what its enemies could do the next day. But as the Russians fell back in disorder, Das Reich's Panzer Grenadier regiments began to advance. Their local counterattacks were by no means a serious breakthrough attempt or flank movement, but they served to keep the Soviets well off balance as the day drew to a close. Events on the Das Reich and Leibstandarte fronts were heavily dependent on the performance of the Totenkopf. At dawn, the Totenkopf Panzer Group in front discovered that the Russian infantry on its front had been relieved by the 3rd Guards Rifle Corps of the 5th Guards Army, 3 divisions reinforced with extra cannons, rocket launchers, and anti-tank guns. Their orders were to destroy the German bridgehead on the far bank of the Selle. Both sides' plans were disrupted when their respective attacks cut across each other's paths. The Totenkopf Panzer Grenadiers were pressed so hard that the tanks had to repeatedly move forward to support them. Intense Soviet artillery fire forced the SS riflemen to seek cover under their own tanks, a last resort for an experienced infantryman. Occupying that ground were 2 Guards Rifle Divisions. The Soviets of the 52nd Guards Rifle Division, moving in their own assault positions, were taken by surprise when the SS appeared head-on. But the Guards were a match for, and even a superior match for, the Totenkopf Panzer Grenadiers in both bravery and tactical skill. According to a political commissar, their political spirit was also high, positions changed hands so often that the exact course of events remains unclear. The SS, with Stuka support as welcome as it was belated, made enough initial progress to raise hopes for the long-delayed link-up with the Leibstandarte. Later, the lead elements of the armoured battle group encountered more and more tanks from Rotmistrov's 181 St. Brigade. German accounts describe spectacular explosions, huge fireballs, and enough losses to instill caution by the time Hill 226 was in German hands. The tanks and Panzer grenadiers encountered a series of defensive positions, some prepared and some improvised, all bristling with anti-tank guns. The Totenkopf tankers attempted to smash through trenches and small redoubts, burying defenders alive in their wake. But it was not until 3 p.m. that the Germans began to break through the Soviet defenses beyond the ground they had recaptured. Small-scale advances continued, however. By 10:45 p.m., the Totenkopf felt comfortable enough to report that its Panzer group had reached the Kartashevka-Prokhorovka road a day late and severely short of men and tanks. On the map, only a few kilometers separated the Totenkopf from the road leading to the rear of the Voronezh front. On the ground, the Leibstandarte's reconnaissance battalion had established fingertip contact, but it was too stretched to be anything more than a wire with nothing behind it. In absolute terms, the day's casualties had not been high, just over 300, but losses were mounting. By this time, the Totenkopf's Panzer Grenadier companies had been reduced to 50 men or fewer, so tired after days of close combat that standard stimulants were having the opposite effect. The armoured regiment had lost nearly half its tanks fighting its way out of the Cell bridgehead. 45 had been destroyed or damaged, including all the Tigers. The crews of the remaining 56 Mark II 3s and 4s were exhausted. Fuel and ammunition were scarce. Although only a few of the disabled tanks were permanently lost, maintenance crews were at the far end of the Cell. Both bringing their men and vehicles forward and pulling the tanks back meant challenging the higher priorities of food, gasoline, and ammunition in one direction, or the evacuation of the wounded in the other. In assessing and placing Kursk in context, several issues remain worth considering. First come the statistics. In material terms, the Soviets claimed to have destroyed nearly 2,800 tanks and assault guns. German archives provide a figure of around 250, and only 10 of these were Tigers. Similar documentation from Soviet records offers a total of 536 armoured fighting vehicles lost for the Central Front, between 1,200 and 1,400 for the Voronezh Front and the Steppe Front reinforcements. Together, the totals vary from 1,600 to over 2,000. Over 54,000 Germans fell in action, were wounded or were considered missing. Total Russian casualties exceeded 320,000. These figures help address some of the prevailing myths of Kursk. The German army on the Eastern Front was neither bled dry nor disgraced by the human and material losses at Citadel. Their Tigers ruled the battlefield wherever they appeared. Even the often maligned Ferdinands rendered great service in the model sector when used appropriately in their intended anti-tank role. Perhaps the intangibles are another story. Whether in the context of irreplaceable combat experience lost through death or wounds, or irreplaceable confidence lost due to an engagement that left the Russians on their feet and the Germans on their knees, after Kursk, these were the ones who reacted to Russian initiatives.